Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's get started. I'll look into the first article. The first article says Crisis in Sri Lanka. What is this article all about? The article here is speaking about the economic turmoil in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is in the verge of bankruptcy. In this particular backdrop, let us try and understand what are the reasons for this economic crisis, what are the consequences of this economic crisis in Sri Lanka, how is Sri Lanka being assisted by India, and what is the way forward when it comes to the economic recovery. First up, let us try and understand what are the major reasons as to why Sri Lanka is going through an economic turmoil. When it comes to Sri Lanka, one of the major industries of Sri Lanka happens to be the tourism industry. Why? Because the tourism industry accounts for about 10% of the country's GDP and was hard hit by the pandemic. Let's go back to the year 2019. What happened? There was Easter bomb attack which took place in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was already hit by this Easter bomb attack. Many countries started issuing warnings to their citizens not to go to Sri Lanka. And in 2020, what we also had is the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of these two issues, number of countries issued warnings as well, and their citizens stopped coming to Sri Lanka. If these citizens do not come to Sri Lanka, their tourism industry is hit, their GDP is hit. This will not bring the foreign exchange to the Sri Lankan economy, and as a result, one of the most important sectors of the Sri Lankan economy was hard hit, and that happens to be the tourism sector. So the major issue why Sri Lanka is facing an economic crisis is its very foundation of the economy. The tourism sector is hard hit. The second important reason why Sri Lanka is facing an economic turmoil is because of the notification issued by the government with respect to the organic farming. What exactly happened? The government's decision to ban the chemical fertilizers to make agriculture 100% organic had a negative impact on the economy. What was this notification all about? We have the government of Sri Lanka. It released a notification according to which most of the farmers in the country will only have to make use of organic products for the generation of crops. So as a result, because they were not supposed to use the fertilizer, the yield and the output of the crops comparatively reduced. The yield had considerably reduced, and this was even less than 50% as well. In this particular backdrop, they were not able to produce the required yield. They had to get the supplies from the foreign countries, and because they were not able to generate enough of output in their country, this resulted in the food crisis in the country. Added to it, the price rise of some of the essentials also started increasing as well. Let's take the example of rice, or let's take the example of sugar. There were a number of people who were hoarding these essentials, which also increased the price of the essentials. When the price of the essentials increased, the government also declared the food emergency in Sri Lanka. This was also another issue that was boiling down to economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So the first major issue was the tourism sector was hard hit. The second major issue that the government released a notification, and this notification of making use of the organic farming did not yield the expected results, and as a result, Sri Lanka started suffering. The third major issue is in reference to the huge foreign debt. Let's look into the graph. When you look into the Sri Lanka, what exactly happens? It started taking money from the international financial institutions, international sovereign bonds, from the foreign governments, as well as other financial markets as well. So what exactly happened? Sri Lanka went through repeated mode of borrowing from multiple international organizations as well as from countries. Let's take the example of the Asian Development Bank, or let's take the example of China, or let's take the example of Japan, India, and many other countries as well. So what it repeatedly did was, it was not able to manage its finances properly, so it started asking money from multiple countries and international organizations. So what it had was a huge debt. It was not able to pay back this debt, and added to it what it also had was interest spiraling as well. So on one side, it had to run its economy. It did not have enough finances to run its economy. It had to take the debt. It had to borrow from the international financial institutions as well as the other countries as well. So in the present backdrop, where they had taken from the Asian Development Bank, they had taken from China, they taken from Japan. In fact, India had also given a lot of money to Sri Lanka as well. And the most important issue that we have to discuss is in the form of the Chinese loans. We have long heard that China believes in what is called as the debt trap diplomacy. What is this debt trap diplomacy? As the very name denotes, what does China do? China gives debts. It has huge pockets. It has large scale finances in its market. So what does China do? It starts investing in developing countries as well as the African countries. So it gives money to these countries. These countries would not be able to pay back, and as a result, they engage themselves in a trap. What is this trap? They give the debt to another country. That country would not be able to pay back the money in this particular case, and as a result, what would happen? China would take over the local resources, and ultimately it would start extracting money as well. So even when it comes to Sri Lanka, China had lent billions of dollars to Sri Lanka in the process of Belt and Road Initiative. What it did, it started financing the infrastructure projects like the highways, ports, airways, and coal power plant. But critics also say that these were the white elephant projects. Why? That is because lot of money was invested into it, but it did not generate any of the profits or the benefits for Sri Lanka. And as a result, what we have is these Chinese loans which are given to Sri Lanka also became white elephant projects. So basically, because of all these issues, they had a huge foreign debt and they're continuously paying these debts. They are not able to pay back debts as well, and ultimately they have landed themselves in trouble. The fourth important parameter is with respect to the forex reserves. When we look into this image, when we look into the forex reserves in the month of May 2021, it was about 4 billion. It is continuously dropping, and in the month of March, it is close by to around $2 billion. So basically, the forex reserves which every country should have is not currently being matched as per the international standards. Why? When you go back to the year 2017, they had a forex reserve of about 7.5 billion, and this has been reduced to about $2 billion in the month of March. So what exactly is happening? Sri Lanka does not have much of the forex reserves, so they have to shell out more cash as well. In case they have to import the foreign goods, they have to spend extra money, and as a result, the value of the Sri Lankan rupee has also depreciated. So basically, what we have is a foreign debt problem. What we also have is a forex reserve issue, and ultimately, people may have to spend extra money to import a foreign good, and this means their forex reserves is also under a lot of issue. Finally, Sri Lankan economy also depends on lot of imports. Let's say for example, some of the essential items like the sugar or the pulses or the cereals, and in fact the pharmaceuticals as well. Most of this are imported from multiple other countries because they are running high on the foreign debts, because they do not have the forex reserves currently, and because they also have to import, they're shelling out extra money as well. So all this means that they're going through a grave crisis in Sri Lanka. As a result of all these economic crises, it is the people of Sri Lanka who are bound to suffer. What could be the consequences, or what has happened in Sri Lanka because of this economic turmoil? Let's take the example of school examinations. We have the school examinations which are supposed to be conducted in the Sri Lankan schools, but unfortunately, because they do not have the papers, because they have to shell out a large amount of money, they had to cancel the school examinations as well. The second major problem is the only refinery that was present in Sri Lanka even ran out of the crude oil in November 2021, and they had to import a lot of oil as well. And during this particular period, there were skyrocketing prices of the oil as well, and nearly 1,000 bakeries across the country also shut down, which basically meant because of the non availability of the cooking gases, some had to shift to kerosene, and these bakeries could not get the gases, and as a result they had to shut down on their operations. And this is where India steps into picture. Whenever there is an excessive inflation in a country, currently Sri Lanka is witnessing a large scale inflation. This is as much as 17.5%. What would happen? It would have implications on India as well, and as a result India has to support Sri Lanka. So what has India done? India since January 2021 has helped with $2.4 billion, including a 400 million currency swap and a 500 million loan deferment for 2 months. On March 17, 2022, Sri Lanka signed a $1 billion credit line with India for the procurement of food, medicines, and other essential items. So, if we speak about it, what we have is an increasing case of inflation, which means the inflation is as much as 17.5%, and this happens to be the worst inflation in Sri Lanka. Let me give you an example. 25 kg of fertilizer would cost around 1500, but now because of the high inflation it is costing around 13,000. 1 kg of rice is now at about 195 rupees. Imagine there are daily wage workers who would earn around 500 to 800 every single day, but 1 kg of rice is about 195 rupees. So this means that people are also facing a lot of issues. They are not able to procure and even buy some of the essential products, and as a result number of people in the northern and the eastern side of Sri Lanka have started moving towards India. Why have they started moving towards India? That is because they are not even able to afford some of the basic essentials for their living. So basically, because of all these issues, they've started moving to India. And where do they come to India? It happens to be Tamil Nadu. One of the natural destinations for these people coming from Sri Lanka happens to be Tamil Nadu. Barely it is 30 kilometers away from the Park State, and they would be able to reach India, and they would be able to reach Tamil Nadu in specific, and that is where we have the Indian intelligence agencies which have also pointed out that in the near future we would also have large number of Sri Lankan refugees who would come knocking the doors of India. They would enter the state of Tamil Nadu because of the economic turmoil in Sri Lanka. Is this the first time that we have seen refugee crisis? No. There have been three waves of refugee crisis earlier from Sri Lanka to India. From 1983, the Sri Lankan Tamils arrived in multiple waves. The first of these was between July 1983 and 1987, when 1.34 lakh Sri Lankan Tamils reached India. This is the first wave. The second wave of arrivals began after the war flared up in June 1990, and about 1,22,000 Tamils fled the island. Between 1991 and 1995, some 54,000 refugees were repatriated to Sri Lanka. This was also the period in which the Sri Lankan Tamils faced a lot of pressure in Tamil Nadu after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. The third wave of arrivals began in 1995 and continued a period that witnessed intense fighting in northern Sri Lanka. The exodus turned into a flood in 2008 and 9, the final years of the war, and refugees continued to arrive until 2013. So because of this economic crisis, we may also have Sri Lankan refugees entering the doors of India. So what is the way forward? What is the economic recovery module that Sri Lanka has to follow? As of now, the article goes on to suggest that Sri Lanka has been knocking the doors of multiple countries, and it has also been asking International Monetary Fund as well. And once these funds are provided, it has to restructure its administration. So basically, the subsidies and the extravagant spending should all be given a check, and some of the measures will have to be taken in a strict manner, so the concessions, subsidies are all taken into picture. We did also discuss the notification given by the Sri Lankan government with respect to the organic farming. The same will also have to be revisited by the Sri Lankan government. In fact, when you look into the northern and the eastern sides, what you also have is the Tamil people. These Tamil people also have a close affiliation with the Indian people from the state of Tamil Nadu. So what should the central government do? It should create a roadmap on the issue of political devolution and economic development with respect to the northern and the eastern sides of Sri Lanka. So basically, they have to make sure that all these northern and the eastern provinces are not hit by the current crisis. So more political devolution, that is powers, will have to be given to these governments, and necessary finances should be given so that they could come out of this economic crisis. The present crisis should also not be used to set up smuggling activities and trafficking. Why? As of now, there are a large scale refugees who are coming from Sri Lanka to India. So during this particular period, the crisis should not be made use of, and we need to also have a vigilant eyes where there can be smuggling activities initiated, trafficking can also take place, and this should be avoided from India's side. So going forward, India also has multiple issues with Sri Lanka. One such issue is the Park Bay fisheries dispute. So India should also speak up to Sri Lanka and settle this issue in an amicable manner. So these are some of the steps that Sri Lanka will have to take going forward, is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the peculiar case of Ladakh's eastern boundary. The article here is speaking about issues and concerns with respect to the Ladakh region and how this can increase in the near future because of the Chinese aggression. In order to prevent this, what we require is settlement of this issue amicably both from India and China, is what is this article all about. Why are we discussing this? That is because we have the Chinese foreign minister in India. He is expected to meet India's external affairs minister, and he will also meet the national security advisor Ajit Doval as well. So during this particular meeting, what we have to settle is this Ladakh issue, is what is this article all about. First up, let's bifurcate this article into three parameters. One is in reference to the territorial limits, next is in reference to the treaties, and third is with respect to what needs to be done going forward. First up, let's understand what is it about the territorial limits. When we speak about the historical picture, let's take the example of Ladakh. Was the boundary of Ladakh clearly given by the British? The answer is no. One of the major problems of the British imperialism that India is still facing is the boundary issue. We have boundary issues with Pakistan, one in the form of Jammu and Kashmir, the other happens to be on the eastern front where we also have Arunachal Pradesh in picture. Another major issue that we are facing because of the British imperialism is also the Ladakh region. When we speak about the Ladakh region, what exactly happened? Let's say, for example, there was no clear-cut mapping that was defined when it comes to the British period, which means that when it comes to the Ladakh, they did not have a clear boundary in the Ladakh region. Instead, what we had is certain regions where there was a large-scale human interaction. Let's say, for example, we have some of the regions like the Demchok. We also had the regions like Karakoram range. We also had the regions like Zojila, where it was these regions where people used to cross over. Why? Because Ladakh is known as the land of passes. So they used to move through these points so that they can conduct their cultural activities, they can conduct their trade related activities. So this meant that the clear boundaries were not defined. Instead, there were few points which were defined on the map. So basically, we did not have a clear-cut mapping when it comes to the Ladakh. It did not have a political boundary being drawn. Instead, there were only few points along the boundary areas, which meant that the British did not clearly mark the pointing or the boundary area along the Ladakh region. So the first major concern is because of the British issue where India and China, India and Pakistan have to face it. So the issue is that they were able to mark only few points where there was a constant human interaction, where there was trade related concepts, cultural related issues that were present, but instead they failed to meet the entire objective of the boundary. Then we have the uninhabited Choda Plains to the east, extending over 100 square miles, now disputed between India and China, were of no use as it was not governed by anyone. What does this mean? This basically means that this was a no man's area. This means that since it was a no man's area, people were not present in this particular area. It was not taken in the form of Ladakh or in the form of the Chinese Tibetan region or the Chinese dynastic rule. So basically, because it was a no man's area, this particular area was also not defined and was also not part of the clearly delineated boundary area back during the British period. Also, there has never been a defined boundary in the eastern Ladakh region because of the high watershed frameworks which cannot be applied in these terrains. Why? Because they are characterized by parallel ranges of Ladakh. So basically, if we have to speak about the Ladakh region on the eastern front, it was only the historical picture of trade and cultural affiliations, but the real political boundaries were not defined as per the territorial limits. So the first major problem is that we did not have a clear-cut border drawn by the British during that particular period. Eventually, over a period of time, there were a number of treaties that were signed. Did these treaties ultimately conclude which part of the Ladakh came to India, which part of the Ladakh came to China? No. We have number of treaties. Let's take the example of Treaty of Timing Song. What exactly happened? It is this Treaty of Timing Song in 1684 which clearly acknowledged Ladakh's independence from the Tibet. It meant that Ladakh emerged as a distinct identity where the treaty was signed between Ladakh and Tibet, ended the Tibet-Ladakh Mughal War and clearly demarcated the boundary between the two countries. So basically, it was the Treaty of Timsong Gang back in the year 1684 which clearly demarcated the boundaries between the Tibet as well as the Ladakh. So this treaty established the relationship between Leh and Lhasa as well. After this, we also have another treaty called as the Treaty of Chushul in 1842. According to it, Ladakh and Tibet agreed to maintain the status quo with respect to the territorial administration. So during 1842, what exactly happened? We had the Sino-Sikh War. This was fought between 1841 up until 1842. So there was a lot of friction, clashes, turmoil, skirmishes, and ultimately, what did they say? That whatever treaty was signed earlier, whatever boundary was agreed earlier, the same will be continued. So there would be status quo, said the Treaty of Chushul in 1842. So basically, we had the Sino-Sikh War, and after this war, they entered into a consensus of respecting the earlier signed treaty. Then we had the Treaty of Amritsar in 1846 between the East India Company and the state of Kashmir, included Ladakh with its eastern border undefined. Under the British rule, the focus remained only on the northern boundary of Ladakh because of the Russian invasion into the Central Asia. So with the Treaty of Amritsar, again there was a confusion. Why? Because the eastern side was not defined by the British, but the northern side was defined. Why? Because they expected that there might be Russian invasion from Central Asia, and as a result, they focused more on the northern border, but the eastern border was completely neglected. So what we have was that the treaties that were signed before the independence were ultimately not helpful to define which are the border areas of Ladakh and which border areas completely fall under the control of India. And finally, we have the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh, which was brought out in 1890, which noted doubtful the boundary demarcation between the Ladakh and Tibet, and the unoccupied Aksai Chin was described as the neutral territory. All this meant that the territorial limits with respect to the historical data was not clearly demarcated. Will the treaties help us? The treaties did not also help us. So ultimately, the author goes on to say that there is a confusion because of which India and China have had clashes with respect to this issue. This was the position before 1947. After 1947, what happens in 1959? Exports of both countries, that is India and China, further hardened their positions. What do we mean by this? This means that both the countries had their own ways of looking at the Ladakh region. They had their own historical data. They also had their own historical justifications as well. So what we had was viewpoints taken both by India and China. In 1993, there was an agreement on the maintenance of peace and tranquility along the line of actual control, which meant that what we started focusing with this particular agreement is not on the historical data as we previously did in 1959, but instead we started focusing on the principles. So we started taking into principles into picture. Both the countries came together. They defined that certain principles have to be there. Why? Because that is the mode of operation for both the countries. So in 1959, we looked at the historical data. We looked at what was happening previously, but a change took place in 1993 where they entered into an agreement where historical data, historical travel path was not to be considered. Instead, let's on a consensus basis define some of the principles, and these principles have to be followed between India and China, said the 1993 agreement. And in the year 2020, the focus shifted to the ground situation and they started having number of rounds of talks after the issue that India and China saw. So how is that we are going to change this particular issue? As of now, if China and India are not able to settle these issues amicably, what would happen? There would be aggression that may be emanating from China, and India may also respond to this, and ultimately this might result in a war like in 1962, and India would take all steps to protect its sovereignty. So this article currently goes on to say that instead of increasing the aggression, what we have to follow is adapt the watershed principle as adapted in the case of demarcating the border of all the Himalayan state, and that seems to be the best way forward to decide on a mutually agreeable boundary. So basically this article goes on to say that as of now, domestic consensus will have to be developed. These countries will have to enter into a consensus. They have to sort out, they have to amicably settle, and the two sides will have to enter into a constant mode of dialogue, reduce the friction points, and ultimately what was not defined historically because of the British imperialistic policies, the same will have to be settled amicably because peace is important between India and China, says this article. Since the eastern boundary of Ladakh is not clearly defined, let's sit down, have dialogue, let's discuss and amicably settle this particular issue with respect to Ladakh, says the author. So all in all, what we have to do is to bring a favorable conclusion to this entire saga of Ladakh issue, says the author. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says at the general's pleasure. The article here is speaking about the democracy and how democracy has been hit in Pakistan. When we speak about democracies, what we have to understand is, let's go back to the year 1947. In the year 1947, both India and Pakistan got their independence. India and Pakistan armies were brought out of the same British tradition, but in many years since the independence, they occupied different positions. When it comes to Pakistan, it is the Pakistan's army which dominates the political sphere, but when it comes to India, it is the civil administration which is able to keep a check on the excess of the army, navy and air force. So basically, the article goes on to say that India has been able to strengthen the democratic institutions, and army, navy and air force is kept a constant check by India, but that is not the same when it comes to Pakistan, as the Pakistan's army has a check over the civil administration. How did it happen? When it comes to India, India was able to constantly monitor the affairs of the army. So during this particular period, Indian army saw a series of budget cuts. India replaced the officer of commander-in-chief with separate army, navy and air force chief, and basically it placed the army, navy and air force under the civil servants, disallowing them to make speeches and keeping senior officers under the surveillance. So what exactly did India do? India had a strong political will. It also had a civil administration, and the entire army, navy and air force was kept under the control of the civil authority. But that was not the same when it comes to Pakistan. If you compare Pakistan in 1977, Pakistan already had two military coups. In fact, for nearly half of its years after the independence, Pakistan has been ruled by powerful military. Why is that? India was able to keep a check. That was not the same with respect to Pakistan. That is because Pakistan was politically weak. When it comes to the Muslim League was organizationally much weaker than the Indian National Congress. When it comes to the Indian National Congress, you had people from all walks of life. They were able to keep a check. They had fought for the freedom of the country. They had people from every nook and corner, from north, south, east, west. But when it comes to the Muslim League, it had the elite people as well, and it had people who were from a particular region, and that happened to be Punjab as well. So all the rich people who wanted to go back to Pakistan were elite support people, and they wanted to control the affairs of Pakistan. When it comes to India, you had the Indian National Congress where people from all sects of life were included. But when it comes to Pakistan, in Muslim League, it was the elite who started governing the affairs of the Pakistan, and these people eventually shifted towards the military, and that is the primary reason why military controls majority of the power in Pakistan. So the first major issue is that the Muslim League was politically weaker in comparison to the Indian National Congress. The second is with respect to hostility towards India. What exactly happens? We all know for the fact that we had India, and India was broken down into India and Pakistan. So Pakistan had a continuous hostility towards India. So what did it say to people? It said that there is an external threat in the form of India. For Pakistan to be protected, for Pakistan's sovereignty to be protected, what Pakistan's military requires is a lot of power. So this constant hostility towards India is what made the power circles in military control a large power institutions, democratic institutions in Pakistan. Added to it, in the year 1971, East Pakistan was lost. East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and eventually the sense of insecurity grew further. So basically, because of the hostility towards India, Pakistan army started consolidating power because it put in the fear into the minds of the people. So democracy was just a name given in Pakistan, but the entire power was captured by the military elite. And finally, they also had the weak judiciary as well. Whenever there is political excess or executive takeover, what it requires is the judiciary to take over and question the acts of the executive and the legislature. But when it comes to Pakistan, there were number of coups that exposed the Pakistan's judiciary failure in enforcing the constitution of Pakistan. If they had a strong judiciary, they would have questioned the ideas of the executive and the military, but because they had a weak judiciary, they could not question the military, and unfortunately, most of the democratic institutions were hit, and the power circles were concentrated only in the hands of the military. So these are some of the reasons as to why there is a lot of control of the military in Pakistan and not the democracy run by the Prime Minister. In the present situation, we recently had Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan, who attacked the Army Chief Bajwa, who praised the Indian Army as not corrupt. In fact, he also said, and I quote, "I salute India. India's foreign policy is better than Pakistan. They work for their people. The Indian Army is not corrupt, and they never interfere in the civilian government." This was a statement made by the Pakistan Prime Minister, where he draws a comparison between the armies of Pakistan and India. And now, in all likelihood, we may not see Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan continue in the near future. As of now, there is a lot of internal turmoil in terms of power politics in Pakistan. So we may see that Pakistan army may remove Pakistan Prime Minister in the near future, and this may end the rule of Prime Minister Imran Khan. As of now, that looks like the most likely prospect, but we have to wait and watch what can happen in Pakistan. Now let's look into the next article. This article says sealed justice, which speaks about the sealed cover doctrine. This has been explained in detail on 8th of March 2022. So kindly look into this video. However, the article also makes a mention of the Muzaffarpur shelter home sexual abuse case where Chief Justice N.V. Ramana has wondered why even an action taken report should be in a sealed envelope and has criticized the sealed covered doctrine of the executive. But what is the sealed covered doctrine? What are the repercussions? What are the issues with respect to the natural justice principle? Has been explained on 8th of March 2022. So kindly look into it. Now let's look into the mains practice questions. Discuss the possible reasons for the economic turmoil in Sri Lanka and its consequences on India. Ambiguity in defining the border in Ladakh have led to disputes and the military standoffs between India and China. Discuss appropriate steps to be taken to restore peace in the region. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review. Do give positive feedback to your friends' answers. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.